Hello everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma 231 here, back in to talk about Navigatoria, chapter number 23. This chapter is titled, His Final Day. And quickly, I just wanted to say a quick, hey guys, I am very sorry about these Navigatoria videos coming out like very late. I'm pretty sure this video is coming out like 3 months after this chapter was initially released, and of course Shonen Jump Plus, or as we call it over here in the West on Manga Plus, which is our best way to read, of course, Navigatoria and all of the other Jump Plus series. So again, I just quickly want to say like, hey guys, I'm very sorry about that, but sometimes I record other videos, and Navigatoria is one of the like more ladder on the bottom videos than like the weekly Shonen Jump videos and some of the other ones I do, but like, hey, whatever it is at the end of the day, still thank you guys for watching this video if you're watching it right now. And we have a very interesting chapter of Navigatoria here today. This chapter really isn't one of my favorite chapters. It definitely seems like it just rushes into a few plot points and just sort of builds on them and just has them sort of happen all in a quick second, which we will be getting into. But overall, I think this is a fine enough chapter and definitely one that has some deep emotion into it at the end of the day. So really, without any further ado, let's just go ahead and get started. Of course, before we get started, we need to talk about what happened last time in Navigatoria. And last time we had this chapter pretty much it was an extra chapter, even though it sort of wasn't. It was a full-length chapter, even though it was labeled as an extra chapter. It was all about Class A and one of the students in Class A named Anastasia and their whole situation regarding Manabu and pretty much all of these other events going on in the manga themselves, and how she sort of relates to Navi and all of these other various characters. So we just got a chapter pretty much about her last time, right? But this chapter, of course, is not in that continuity whatsoever, and it sort of goes off the ending of chapter number 22, which is pretty much Admiral Morel pretty much going, guys, it looks like we have an attack coming in from space, and that is where we ended that chapter, and that is much more in line wherever this chapter starts right here. As we actually start the chapter with Manabu sort of walking through the halls of the Navigatoria school, and we see that a few Earth Army people are running by, and one accidentally bumps into Manabu, as Manabu's sort of like there, like sitting there, and he's just walking through, and this Earth Army guy just sort of runs into him, and Manabu's like, hey, whoa, that sort of hurt there, right? And this guy's like, hey, sorry, I'm in a hurry, and he's like, oh, sorry, no worries, as Manabu just says like, wow, the Earth Army soldiers seem kind of restless, right? As we see that whenever Manabu gets to his class, we see there's a bunch of various debate going in during the class, right? And we see one of these students is pretty much just going like, hey, it looks like a huge war is starting near this planet, right? And they're pretty much just going like, wow, I mean, it's crazy, like an interplanetary war. And Manabu hears this as he sort of walks into the classroom. He's like, oh, hey, can you like please fill me in, please, on like all of the various stuff going on here, right? And the student pretty much just brings up to a point of like, hey, see, because of that, this area won't be able to use wormholes for a little while either, right? And one student's like, oh, wormholes, right? And our student just says like, oh yeah, you didn't come through one, didn't you, right? And this student pretty much explains like, hey, wormholes are the highways of space, so to speak, right? It's space tech that maintains a connection between that planets have with one another. Through the distance between Earth and the Mental is a half light year away, we can travel between them in 10 whole days thanks to wormholes. Pretty much explaining like, hey, this is a very much faster method of transportation between these various areas, right? And the student's like, whoa, that's like actually crazy, right? And we see one of the girls in the classrooms like, oh wow, I guess that makes sense why my family hasn't been responding to my letters recently, right? And our student's like, oh yeah, I was wondering that same thing too, right? It was a little bit interesting. It's like, hey, I guess all of these students have to send letters home, but they don't have any way of other two-way communication with them, right? Which does make a little bit of sense, right? As we see that Admiral Andrés Centeno is now in the room now, as he just comes over to the student and just says like, hey, it looks like somebody's been studying hard, right? And she's just like, hey, as representative of my nation, that much should be obvious, right? As then everybody's like, oh wait, professor, like, what are you doing in here right now, right? As Admiral Andrés pretty much says like, hey, I'll be stationed at the academy from now on, and everybody's like, oh wow, that's actually great, right? But Manabu ends up bringing up the point of like, hey, but is it not being able to use wormholes, like, it's a really serious and big deal, isn't it, right? And like, hey, what about food from the Earth Army, right? Or what about food from Earth, right? As Andrés Centeno pretty much is like, hey, yeah, it'll be a little while till they reopen, but we have lots of bases on other planets, and we can just fly to those and like get resources from them and not have to worry about Earth supplying literally everything, right? That's why we have allied planets. So like, hey, well, I'm off to tell all of the other classes that I'm stationed here, pretty much, right? And we see that everybody in the classroom's like, whoo, okay, this is actually pretty nice. It doesn't seem like this massive war is going to have an impact on us students, right? But as all of them are sort of saying that, we see that Riko-tan walks over into the room and just is like, oh, Manabu, like, you don't think so? And Manabu's like, oh, hey, Riko-tan, what's up, right? As he just is like, hey, the Navigatoria project might be stopped midway again, right? And Manabu just thinks like, oh yeah, wait a second, like, hey, that's right, this school system made for selecting Navigatoria has already been put on hold because of trouble once before. As we remember what Xavier said a few chapters ago about like, hey, that makes you all second generation students, right? And Manabu sort of thinks about this being like, oh, and that would mean that I couldn't become a Navigatoria, which would mean I'd have to be executed by Master Kirin, right? Or Kirin. I need to know how to say that name for later in this chapter, right? As he also thinks to, of course, good old Hina, and he just says like, hey, thank you, Hina, in my heart for continuing to support me, right? As we see, there's a fun little thing where Riko-tan is just like very much questioning what Manabu is doing here, like, huh? Like, why is he talking to himself, right? But at this point, we cut over to see what Master Kirin is doing in this moment, as we see that he's got a gun in his hand, a very glassy-eyed expression, as he goes through and cocks his gun, pretty much pulling back the head of it, slamming it forward, and he just says, hey, it looks like I'll finally have to use this soon. And it's like, what? Dun, 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 dun. But pretty much all sort of explained pretty shortly here, as we see that Manabu ends up getting back to his flat, pretty much, where he is being stayed at by the army of, like, he's staying in his dormitory, right? Of course, I'm a dormitory right now. I don't know why these words are so hard for me to come up with, right? As we see that Manabu sort of walks into his house, and we see that Master Kirin is sitting right in there, right? And Manabu has a very interesting reaction of like, oh, hey, what are you doing in here, Mr. Kirin? Like, what's going on? He's like, hey, he's trespassing on my dorm. And he's like, oh no, like, is he really here to execute me? Like, no way. As Manabu's sort of like rushing to do everything perfect to make sure he doesn't mess up and get shot in the head, pretty much. As he's like, hey, I'll go pour us some tea, right? And we see that Kirin already has it set up on the table, right? And he's like, hey, Manabu, like, don't worry, just please take a seat, right? As Manabu sort of sits down and just thinks like, hey, Mr. Kirin is a soldier and comes from Mujinko just like me. And he's like, hey, and he also could be the guy who may execute me, right? As Kirin just says like, hey, I have something to tell you, Manabu. And he's like, hey, will you listen to me? And Manabu sort of like shakes his head and sort of like some nervousness of like, yes, I will, right? As Kirin just says like, hey, the truth is, I have someone who is very, very dear to me back home. And Manabu's like, huh, like, what are you talking about? And Kirin's like, oh, like, you're trying to interrupt my story? But Manabu's like, hey, sorry, nothing. Please continue, right? As Kirin just sort of goes in, like, some narration of some sorts, pretty much just saying, like, hey, her name is Lycra Kirin, a woman of noble status with a state-appointed fiancé. Though our last names were the same as the head of the Kirin family, her social status was different from mine, who came from a sub-branch of the family. As we see a little image when what was her name again? When both Lycra and the Kirin we sort of know in the series were both younger. We see that even though Lycra was, of course, a higher social status, she was the type of person who would always sort of intermingle and, like, take the Kirin we know by the hand and sort of lead him all around, right? As we pretty much just sort of see this scene, we also see 5 years ago from our present timeline, as Kirin says, oh, an academy in space? And Lycra just says, like, oh yeah, I mean, you're not really allowed to talk to anyone about it. It's some top secret thingamajig the Earth Army officials gather kids up for. You're also enrolling in the Earth Army, so you might even be together in space. It seems like they have a very, very close bond, right? As Kirin just says, like, hey, she participated in the Navigatoria project 5 years ago as the representative of the Mujinko Republic, which is very interesting, being like, okay, this Lycra was actually the, Lycra was the person who was the, predecessor to Manabu, which is very, very interesting, right? And Manabu's like, oh, the first term? And Kirin's like, oh, so did you know about it? And Manabu's just like, hey, the first terms got swept up into some sort of trouble, didn't they, right? And it's like, hey, I thought they all died. And Kirin just is like, hey, no, they didn't all die. For instance, Lycra's legs were very much injured and she went back to Earth. And he's like, hey, Manabu, I was really earnestly rooting for you, right? And he's like, hey, you also have someone that you love that the state assigned to someone else, didn't you, right? And we see that Manabu's like, oh no, did he find out about Hina? This is really, really bad, right? As Kirin just says like, hey, you and I are very similar. As we see that he puts down his cup of tea and starts to leave Manabu's dormitories, he just says like, hey, Manabu, thank you very much for listening to my story. I must have bothered you by barging in like that, right? And Manabu's like, hey, no, you didn't really at all, Kirin. Like, hey, you just caught me by surprise. It's simple as that, right? And your support has always been a great help to me. Like, hey, and the animals really, really like you too, right? As we see that Kirin starts to walk away, and we see that his face is obscured in this moment, as he just says like, hey, I really hope you two find happiness. As we sort of see an image of course, Manabu standing next to Hina, and in front of them, we see Kirin is standing right next to Lycra, hand in hand, right? As we see there's sort of a little bit of a wind blows, and Manabu sort of like winces a little bit from like the coldness of the wind. And as he looks in front of him, he doesn't see Master Kirin there anymore. As you get a little bit of narration from Manabu's perspective of, hey, after that night, I never saw him again. As we see an image of Kirin laying dead on the ground somewhere, gun in his hand, and a gunshot wound right next to his heart in his chest. And we see the blood is pulling out of him, and we see 4 shell casings laying all around him, right? As we see a little bit of a laughing going, ha ha ha, right? As we see this guy's just, who also just went and shot Kirin, says like, hey, going against the Mujinkno Republic, you fool, haha. I will take over the honorable state orders from the Supreme Leader which you have defiled, and I will execute them flawlessly. As we see that this person has a very nasty wound over their, what eye is that? That would be their right eye, where presumably that Kirin shot them in the head pretty much. As we cut to the next morning, where Manabu is sleeping inside of course, his dormitory, his alarm is going off at 4 a.m. in the morning, and as soon as it goes off, before Manabu can even react, we see that there's somebody here who's come over and ripped off the covers from right over Manabu. And Manabu's very freaked out about all of this, as we see that this is the same person who we just saw who apparently Kirin was going to shoot and end up killing. As we get introduced to this guy, as Manabu's like, oh, well, hey, good morning, like, who are you, right? As this guy just is like, hello, my name is Hakutaku. Kirin has been fired. I will be giving my all as your support in his stead. It is for all the wonderful Supreme Leader, my loyalty to Mujinkno Republic, right? As we see that Manabu is sort of just like looking at this like, oh no, like what's going on, like Mujinkno loyalty, right? And he's like, I get the feeling that Master Kirin's replacement is very dangerous. As he just thinks like, oh, hey, it's nice to meet you, right? As you get a little bit of narration just saying, hey, half a year until the election. There are 2 more special assignments remaining. To seize the victory and become Navigatoria, the wise wolves are now starting to show their fangs. As we see that Navi is standing in front of the various board where all of the class rankings are posted, and she's like, oh, I'm not in first? And that is where we end this chapter of Navigatoria with the little bit of a text saying like, hey, the fight to become a Navigatoria reaches its climax. And yes, this chapter really ratchets up the Navigatoria pace, as we really just go from this various idea of having the whole thing of like, okay, we're sort of progressing the Navigatoria story. Aiden isn't here anymore. Rikotan and Manabu are starting to become better friends and sort of start to understand each other more. And we suddenly get this chapter really about his final day, of course, talking about Master Kirin, who presumably has gone over to this Hakutaku fellow because they were either somebody who was the proposed marrier of Lycra, or just somebody different in general. Now, we do have a little bit of an interesting thing here, being that, really, is Lycra just, like, the best friend of Kirin, or is there more of a sort of love triangle going on there within, like, the Kirin family, which is a little bit of a, like, interesting thing to sort of think of. Like, even if they are from like really big branch families that aren't sort of related anymore, like still, that does seem a little weird, especially when Manabu's got this whole thing with Hina of like, yeah, they're just totally different and they've got a very different situation than it seems that Lycra and Kirin ended up having. But either way, we see that Kirin has died in this moment, and it seems like the person he was trying to kill, Hakutaku, is now the person who is sort of ruling over Manabu as the Earth Army attended to them, which is very much think of like, okay, what are these stakes going on? And then to also cut a very long time into the future of like, hey, we now have this very simple thing of like, hey, half year until the election, we see that, granted, I don't know if this is a full year long thing or if it's a 9-month sort of school thing, so like, hey, we don't really know the full timeline, but either way, things are ratcheting up because, hey, somebody else is being smarter than Navi in this moment and getting the top scores, which is something that Navi can't be having whatsoever. So I'm really interested to see where this sort of series goes from here, and like definitely a very interesting chapter, but one that has a lot of potential to be showing towards the future of what this series can be. And hey, I am really all here for it to be getting into this series more and to be going through and actively reading all of these chapters because, hey, I have been very, very behind on manga reviews, especially with Navigatoria, so just to get through it and get done, it's pretty good, and I just enjoy this series in general, and that's why I talk about it. So hey, thank you guys very much for watching this video on Navigatoria chapter number 23. If you did enjoy it, I've got a few other Navigatoria videos on the channel. You guys can go check out those. There'll be an end card on the video, also a playlist down in the description down below, and also just other various places, like just go to my YouTube channel and like find all of the videos I make there. I make plenty of other anime and manga related content, and hey, if you like this review, you may end up liking those too. But yeah, either way, thank you very much, guys. Thank you guys very much for watching this video, and I will catch you next time for Navigatoria chapter number 24. Again, until next time, I'll see you guys later. Again, this was chapter number 23, titled His Final Day, and yeah, I'll catch you guys next time. This will be Glowplasma 231, signing out.